It was a balmy Caribbean day in November of 1861. The winds of war, already fierce on the American continent, were about to stir the Atlantic. Amid the tumult of the Civil War, a single incident on the high seas brought two nations, the United States and Great Britain, to the very brink of armed conflict. This is the story of the Trent Affair. The implications of the American Civil War stretched far beyond the battlefields of Virginia and Pennsylvania. Britain and France observed the war's progress keenly, both with their own economic and political interests in mind. Britain, at the time, was the foremost empire in the world, its industries powered by the labor of workers in the cotton mills of places like Lancashire. The cotton that flowed into Britain came mostly from the southern states of America, so when war broke out, it sent shockwaves through Britain's economy. Southern cotton, once abundant, now lay in scarcity. The Union blockade threatened to choke off the South's greatest export, and while many in Britain sympathized with the plight of the southern states, particularly those whose livelihoods depended on the cotton trade, others, deeply influenced by the abolitionist movement, were reluctant to support a cause so openly tied to the institution of slavery. Across the English Channel, Napoleon III of France watched with interest. A man of ambition, he saw the fragmentation of the United States as a potential opportunity to increase France's influence in the Western Hemisphere. A weakened America, divided by a successful Confederacy, might allow France to expand its influence in Mexico, where Napoleon had already installed Maximilian of Austria as emperor. But like Britain, France also tread carefully, wary of provoking the Union, which was still a growing industrial powerhouse. On November 8, 1861, the waters of the Bahama Channel would become the stage for a dramatic confrontation, a clash between the forces of war, diplomacy, and raw ambition. The British mail packet Trent, carrying Confederate diplomats James Mason and John Slidell, was making its way from Havana to St. Thomas, its passengers unaware of the Union Navy's keen interest. The Trent, a vessel built for speed and comfort, was carrying two men whose diplomatic mission could change the course of the entire war. Captain Charles Wilkes of the USS San Jacinto was the man who would decide the fate of the Trent. For months, Wilkes had been chasing Confederate ships, preying on Union merchant vessels. Mason and Slidell, both prominent figures of the Confederacy, were traveling to Europe in the hope of gaining support from Britain and France. Wilkes knew that allowing them to reach Europe could tip the balance of power in favor of the South. Yet in pursuing his mission, he would provoke a crisis of unprecedented proportions. Among Wilkes's officers was Lieutenant Donald Fairfax, a man who would soon find himself at the heart of a diplomatic storm. Fairfax was a career officer, pragmatic and disciplined, and aware of the complexities of international law on the high seas. Unlike many of his comrades who either didn't know or didn't care, Fairfax knew that seizing Mason and Slidell aboard a neutral vessel might violate Britain's rights under maritime law. Fairfax had reservations. His instincts told him that boarding the Trent was a delicate matter. To capture two Confederate envoys could be a bold strike for the Union cause, but it could also ignite a firestorm with Britain, a nation that might very well consider the act an affront to its sovereignty. But Fairfax was a man of duty, and duty would call. When Lieutenant Fairfax and his men boarded the Trent, they were of course met with hostility. British Captain James Moore, his voice filled with outrage, demanded to know why his ship was being stopped. Fairfax, as measured as he was, calmly explained that the Union had orders to arrest Mason and Slidell. It was a delicate moment, one that could spiral into violence if handled poorly. But Fairfax remained composed, ensuring his men did not draw weapons unless absolutely necessary. Mason and Slidell were not surprised. Both were seasoned politicians. Mason, a former U.S. Senator with a fiery temper, Slidell, a lawyer with a sharp tongue. When Fairfax informed them of their arrest, they refused to cooperate. They knew the risks of their mission, but to be captured by the Union Navy aboard a neutral vessel was an insult they would not easily forget. Yet Fairfax did not use force. He did not shackle them, he did not strip them of their dignity. He ordered their transfer to the San Jacinto with professionalism, but without any fanfare. Amid jeers and threats from the passengers of the Trent, Mason and Slidell were escorted off the ship. It was a scene of high drama, but it was also one of restraint. Fairfax, mindful of the delicate nature of the moment, ensured no unnecessary violence. He was a man who understood the power of diplomacy, even in the heat of a naval confrontation. Once aboard the San Jacinto, Mason and Slidell were placed under arrest, and Wilkes' self-appointed mission was considered a success. But for Fairfax, the triumph was bittersweet. He knew the incident would have consequences no one could yet fully know. Returning to Union shores, Mason and Slidell were removed and imprisoned as prisoners of war in Massachusetts. In London, the reaction was immediate and it was fierce. Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, was no stranger to crises, but this moment tested his political resolve as never before. The British people, enraged by what they saw as an affront to their sovereignty, called for immediate retribution. The press stirred the flames of anger, demanding that Britain respond in kind to the perceived insult. Newspapers belittled the American military. To them, the U.S. Navy was a feeble dwarf navy. The Army was nothing more than a shapeless mass of incoherent squads. For the British public, the Trent was more than a ship. It was the symbol of British honor and dignity, trampled upon by the overreaching power of the Union Navy. Many cried for war. Palmerston's response was swift. He called an emergency meeting of his cabinet, where the question of how to react to the Union's actions was debated with heated passion. Some ministers clamored for war, seeing the insult to British dignity as an irreparable breach. But Palmerston, though a man of formidable national pride, understood the fragility of the moment. Britain was not prepared for war with the United States, not in 1861, when the Union was building a modern, industrialized military force, and Britain did not have the means to stop the Americans from taking Canada. Instead, Palmerston called for the immediate release of Mason and Slidell. In Washington, President Abraham Lincoln and his Secretary of State, William H. Seward, faced a crisis of their own. To Lincoln, along with the majority of the people in the North, the capture of Mason and Slidell had been a victory, a strategic move to weaken the South's hopes of gaining European recognition. But Seward, ever the diplomat, understood the potential for disaster. The British were a formidable power. To ignore their demands would invite catastrophe. Like Palmerston, President Lincoln understood the complex and delicate nature of the situation. He knew the Union could ill afford to fight on two fronts. The Civil War was already taxing the nation's resources, and war with Britain, a powerful adversary, could well tip the balance and destroy all hope of restoring American national unity. Yet he could not afford to appear weak in the eyes of Europe, especially when the European powers were so keenly watching the unfolding conflict with their own interests in mind. Sir John Russell, the British Foreign Secretary, was tasked with the delicate duty of communicating Britain's official stance to the United States. He sought an opinion from the Queen, who had her husband and consort Prince Albert review the matter. Prince Albert believed that an ultimatum was too harsh, and drafted a letter that offered a path to an honorable resolution for both countries. It would be the last great service Prince Albert gave his adopted country before dying a few weeks later of typhoid fever. Russell incorporated Albert's softened tone in a firm but measured letter demanding the release of Mason and Slidell. Her Majesty's government, Russell wrote, considers the detention of the Confederate commissioners to be an act of aggression and demands their immediate release. The message was clear, yet the tone was calculated. Britain sought no war, it sought justice, and above all, it sought respect. Seward, a master of political maneuvering, drafted the American response. His tone was one of defiance but also contrition. The Union, he wrote, deeply regretted the incident and acknowledged the gravity of the British demand. But the American government could not overlook the strategic necessity of the capture. The Confederacy, Seward argued, could not be allowed to send envoys to foreign nations seeking recognition under the protection of a neutral flag. The exchange of letters between the two nations was a delicate affair, each word carefully chosen to avoid the slightest hint of provocation. Russell, though firmly committed to Britain's position, was no stranger to the art of diplomacy. He understood that an outright war with the United States was a dangerous proposition, and though Britain had every reason to be offended by the Union's actions, the specter of an expanding war with a nation so far across the Atlantic made Palmerston and his ministers pause. Lincoln, for his part, was not without political acumen. He knew that releasing Mason and Slidell would be seen as a humiliating retreat by Northerners, but he also understood that the greater good of preserving the Union and avoiding further international entanglements outweighed the political fallout. The American response was sent, measured, contrite, acknowledging Britain's right to expect respect. The envoys would be released. The diplomatic crisis was diffused, though not without cost. The United States released Mason and Slidell, and the British, in turn, refrained from further escalation. Both nations had been tested, their resolve and honor questioned, but neither had been willing to push matters into the realm of war. The Trent Affair, as it became known, had brought two powerful nations to the brink, but the cautious diplomacy of men like Seward, Palmerston, Prince Albert, and Russell had prevented a calamity. The Trent Affair could have escalated into a full-blown conflict between the United States and Britain. But history's course was altered by diplomacy and restrained actions. The Union, realizing the cost of further antagonizing Britain, released Mason and Slidell, though offered no formal apology. The incident was diffused, and Europe remained largely on the sidelines of America's Civil War. Yet the affair remains a stark reminder of how fragile peace can be, how a single misstep on the world stage could tip the scales towards war.